My name is John Cullen. I've written the chapter on Leading Through Contingencies, and the chapter looks at what contingency theories are, how they impact on how leadership has been done in the past, their place in the development of leadership theory, and what they might possibly do in the future for people who are interested in studying or doing leadership. I think one of the reasons why people have such deep interest in the topic of leadership, and they have done in a perennial way, is that it tells us a lot about ourselves and our relationships to the world and to other people around us, and how we relate to power, and how we, sometimes we relate to it in ways that benefit us but may not benefit other people. And if you are fascinated by leadership, and if you read a lot about it, and I read a lot about it because it's one of kind of my enduring academic passions, if you like, it's you'll, in every introduction to leadership, in every textbook on leadership, there'll be a chapter in there somewhere on contingency approaches to leadership. And what strikes me is that contingency approaches to leadership get very much, I won't say lip service, but they're treated and discussed in a way that says, okay, these are things that were important because they were fashionable at one particular time in contemporary leadership theory history, but they're a little bit unfashionable. They're like the pair of flares that people might have in their in their wardrobe somewhere, and you've got to take them down and say, this is what people wore, if you like, in terms of leadership theory at one stage. But we recognise their limitations now. I think part of the reason why their contingency theories have been passed over, and why they are, you might get one or two lectures over a module on leadership, for example, is that there needs to be some kind of nod towards the contribution that they made. But really, I think, from talking to people and from reading the textbooks, the reasons why they're kind of, here they are, this is what they said, and here's why they're on the shelf, are for a couple of reasons. So there may be 2, 3, 4 reasons why these theories have gone into abeyance. I think the first one is that they've been superseded by a lot of the more kind of shiny theories of leadership, things like transformational leadership and charismatic leadership, and even after that have more recently been picked up on by more ethical forms or critical approaches to studying leadership. We'll actually try and look at the theoretical core of these things that I think contingency approaches to leadership have often been accused of missing. The second reason is that they're heavily used by consultants and in executive education for practical training courses. And the big concern about that is, okay, it's great to do a contingency type analysis of your leadership style or a case study in a classroom, but just how practical is it for somebody who's leading a business, running an organization, who needs to demonstrate leadership? How practical is it for them to assess the relationship with their followers, assess the relationship with their changing environment around them, and change accordingly to that? It's almost an impossible thing to do. So the practicality of contingency approaches to leadership is also another big issue. So if they've been superseded by different theoretical approaches or by different pedagogical approaches, and if they've become the property of consultants, this means that interest in them amongst people who develop new theories in leadership has dropped off. So if you check, how much work has been done on contingency approaches to leadership within the academic research literature, there isn't as many as there would have been in other areas of leadership. So does this mean that we throw them in the bin because they're not fashionable anymore, or because researchers appear not to be interested in them, or do we keep nodding to them and say that they're there? Or can we go back to contingency approaches to leadership and try and figure out just what it is that they brought to people in the first place, because they offered a very usable model, and are they actually applied in interesting leadership situations? One of the things that I've noticed where contingency leadership could potentially be used and tested, and I don't mean in an applied way where people say, this is how you learn how to be a leader, this is how you develop your style, this is what good leadership is by looking at some of the more interesting areas in which leadership is actually done. And this has drawn me to, drug dealing gangs and work that's been done on these, going right back to work such as, down these mean streets, bourgeois in search of respect, to more contemporary works like Sudhir Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day. And we can see this rendered in a very, very vivid way in the fantastic TV show The Wire. what we learn from these analyses, which are based on ethnographic data, is that when you have gang leaders working in these scenarios, we quite rightly don't like what it is that they do. We don't like how they do it. We don't like seeing what happens to people who use their products or people who fall afoul of these gangs. So we never try to glamorize it. But what these ethnographies do is they actually get under the surface of what what leadership means in this particular situation. And there's a key contingency that we often forget about. It's this question that we can ask ourselves: would we be different people ethically? Would we be different people socially? Would we just be different if we were born into another situation other than the ones in which we find ourselves in? And that's a really, really interesting question. It's something that Max Weber looked at in his explorations of bureaucracy and charisma and leadership as well. So we can look at these scenarios and we can say, let's look at what these gang leaders do. And what we tend to see is that there is a very, very ultra-capitalistic business orientation within the minds of these leaders. There is a character in The Wire, for example, Stringer Bell, who's based on a composite of numerous gang leaders, who goes to business school, who takes a very economized approach to his dealings, who often advocates to his gang members that they don't take violent actions or get involved in reprisals, or they don't take on board any of the more kind of aggressive approaches that we usually associate with drug dealing. And he, sometimes he wins, sometimes he doesn't. But the reason that he doesn't do that is because it doesn't make good business sense to do it, because it will draw the attention, it'll affect profits, it'll draw the attention of the police and regulatory authorities. So it's quite interesting to look at these capitalistic businesses, for want of a better word, that live in the underground that's all around us. And when you look at individuals like this, and when you look at how they do leadership, there is an intense focus on their relationship with their followers. They're constantly monitoring it so they can moderate it. They need respect as a commodity or some capital that they can use to ensure that they continue to make money. So they're constantly looking at the environment around them. They're constantly looking at the stakeholders in their business. And they're very, very aware of everybody who is working with them and how they need to demonstrate leadership with them. We might imagine that it's a fear-based scenario in which these individuals find themselves. But really, they have to operate with a real mechanics of care towards the people who are working with them. And I think that by looking at not just drug dealing gangs, but by how leadership is done in a variety of different situations, that we can see how people who do leadership or people who do followership in these scenarios, how they can actually think about how the contingencies between these variables work. There has been a recent, I won't say a spike, but a growth in the research literature on contingency theories to leadership, and there's a graph in the chapter that shows this. They tend to bring it back to the culture of the organization, the culture in which followers and leaders find themselves in. I'm not saying that this is the beginning of a new era of critical approaches to contingency studies and leadership, but it does demonstrate that because a theory is interesting and useful at one stage, because it falls out of flavour or fashion, doesn't mean that it is now obsolete, that it is part of leadership theory, trying something out, finding out that it's interesting to a certain point, and then putting it away or storing it until it's needed for a particular scenario. It instead demonstrates that there is so much that's gone on that these theories can be used and thought about again in a way that deepens our own understanding of what leadership is, how leadership is developing, and who we are ourselves as leaders and what leadership means to us.